Welcome to the Fire These Times, a podcast dedicated to the easy task of tackling the 21st century from the periphery. I'm your host, Jure Ayub, and my goal is to use this platform to connect with activists, scholars, writers, and other weird folks from around the world to link our stories and interests up. Join me as we get into all sorts of futurisms, from solar punk to degrowth, as we explore meaningful ways of creating links between the peoples on the periphery, and as we explore various topics from tech to anti-authoritarian politics, feminism, abolitionism, decolonialism, anti-racism, and all the other fun isms in between. This podcast is ad-free and accessible to everyone thanks to the generous donations of Patreon supporters on patreon.com/firethesetimes. For as little as $5 a month or $50 a year, you can help keep this podcast independent that way. If you're a student, unemployed, or in any kind of financial difficulties, you can support with $2 a month or $20 a year. There are also other methods such as on PayPal or buymeacoffee.com, and you can find the relevant links in the description below or on the website. My goal is to make this project financially sustainable so that I can work on producing valuable content on a regular basis, such as this podcast, the newsletter, my essays, various online resources, and hopefully eventually YouTube essays as well. And if you like the content of this podcast, you can also check out the newsletter. In that newsletter, which I release on a quasi-monthly basis, I reflect on some of the topics discussed on this podcast and try to take them a bit further. The newsletter is free and you can get it by simply subscribing directly on the website. The Fire These Times is named after the James Baldwin book The Fire Next Time, and the music is by Ibrahim Yusuf. Thank you for listening and take care. Hey everyone, so this is a conversation with Sharon Yam. It's her second time on the podcast. She'll introduce herself in a bit for those of you who haven't listened to the first episode, which is episode 46, Hong Kong Disappearances and the Cost of Disinformation. Now this one isn't related to the first episode, so you don't have to listen to it in order to follow this conversation. In this episode, we spoke about primarily a paper that she wrote called Complicating Acts of Advocacy, Tactics in the Birthing Room. So we got into a lot of different concepts that Sharon was kind enough to kind of get into and explain for a wider audience. These include rhetorical analysis, reproductive justice and doulas, rhetoric of health and medicine, technocratic model of birth, the 3 pillars of reproductive freedom and their global implications, and so on and so forth. We also got into kind of a broader question of what makes some stories untellable, and as well as getting into the pitfalls of the self-made mom rhetorics, and finally the links between rhetoric and the antivaxx movement, which is still unfortunately pretty topical. So that's it from me, folks. Thank you for listening and take care.
Hi, my name is Sharon Yam, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Kentucky in the Department of Writing, Rhetoric, and Digital Studies. I'm also a faculty affiliate in the Gender and Women's Studies Department and the Center for Equality and Social Justice.
Well, Sharon, thanks for coming back again. Last time I had you on, we were mainly talking about Hong Kong. For those listening, that's episode 46. It's called Hong Kong Disappearances and the Emotional Cost of Disinformation. It was quite a heavy episode, but I actually quite enjoyed it. It was felt very cathartic. Okay, so today we'll be talking about a number of things. The title of the episode, for now, I don't know if I'm going to change it, is Complicating Acts of Advocacy, Reproductive Justice and Rhetorical Analysis. So let's just start from the start, because even the title alone might confuse a lot of people, I think. We'll be primarily talking about a paper that you wrote. Can you just talk a bit about the paper, sort of like introduce us to it?
Yeah, so in that particular paper, I was looking at a series of YouTube videos called the Doula Diaries. It's made by the media company Romper. So in that series, they were focusing on doulas. And again, I'm going to kind of rewind a little bit for folks who may not know what doula is. Doula is actually an ancient Greek term that means a woman servant or woman slave. And so right now, you may often hear mainstream discourse about birth doulas, postpartum doulas. So those are professional support people that will guide a pregnant and birthing person throughout the process. Increasingly, there are also other kinds of doulas, including adoption doulas or even death doulas. So doulas are essentially a support person, again, trained, but they're not medical professionals that are meant to guide somebody and accompany somebody through a major life transition stage. Again, because the etymology of that word is not really great. Again, nobody wants to be called like a slave or a woman servant. Some people are starting to calling that a birth support person or birth worker. And so the YouTube series that I analyzed, they follow several different birth workers as they support different kind of pregnant and birthing person. All of them are in a heterosexual relationship, but a big portion of them are women of color, especially Black women. So in my article, I was analyzing these series of videos because on the one hand, they did an amazing job representing how birth workers are able to support, in this case, women of color that are disproportionately being targeted by obstetric racism. But also on the other hand, video series like this one kind of reinforce the idea that only heteronormative and nuclear families exist. And so by applying what I call a reproductive justice oriented framework to study that, I'm able to kind of also simultaneously recognize what this video series is done well, but also at the same time, what kind of family formations they are marginalizing.
Right. That's honestly really interesting. And how did you go from rhetorical analysis to thinking about the link between that and reproductive justice? What does that sort of look like for you?
So I again my first interest started is that I'm interested in the ways in which birth workers advocate for people. Again, as a rhetorician, we think a lot about advocacy and persuasion, right?
Right.
So there's a tricky thing that happened with birth workers is that they are not medical professionals. So when they go into a hospital setting, they are really just kind of on the whim of the medical provider can, at a drop of a hat, say that I don't like your presence, you're out of the birthing room, right? So in those instances, if they got kicked out, then they won't be able to advocate for their marginalized clients. But on the other hand, if they were to stay there and not say anything overtly, even when there are instances of medical racism, then they're also not advocating and not necessarily doing their clients any favor. And so, as a rhetorician, I was really curious as to how birth workers, and most of them women, navigate this kind of tension. Like, how do you advocate without being confrontational? And also, how do you also negotiate that their liminal status is that they are professional, so they've seen so many more birth than their client, but their experience is often not recognized by a lot of medical providers because they also doesn't have like medical training. So they kind of have this liminal space of like authority versus being seen as an amateur, just like an auntie. And so I started doing interviews with these birth workers and like, how do you do this? Do you even advocate at all? Or do you see your role as merely a comforting presence? And so that's how I started doing that. And while I was conducting qualitative research on birth workers, I also encounter the reproductive justice, which is a theoretical framework and also a praxis started by women of color and Black women in around 1994. And so my question then became, because there's also around this time recently more and more birth workers saying that we want to not just focus on birth, but we want to be focusing on reproductive justice as a whole. So to also think about, being an abortion doula, like covering all spectrum of reproduction. So that's when I started to make the connection that how exactly can we use this kind of thinking into and incorporate that into the rhetorical analysis that we do.
So you look at these doula diaries, and listeners know this by now. I'll obviously include all of these links in the show notes. It's on YouTube. Um, how does one? What are some common? I don't know if that's a weird question, but what are like common motivations for someone to want to become a doula? Is it like a happenstance? Is it like a generational? Like I did it because my parents did it. That kind of thing. How does it happen?
Oh, so this is interesting. I can only speak for the U.S. context.
Sure. Yeah.
So doulas earlier on, before childbirth is so medicalized and to an extent pathologized. doulas are just kind of people in your community that has older women, usually have a lot of experience giving birth or kind of taking care of babies, and they'll show up while you're giving birth, in addition to the midwife. But later on, when the OBGYN profession kind of took over midwifery, birth became more medicalized, and so doulas or birth workers is a little bit less common. And then kind of in around the 70s and 80s, to white women in the US, at least this is kind of the mainstream discourse. Of course, Black granny midwives have been doing that for a long time. They started professionalizing doula as a profession that people could get trained in. So the Penny Simkin is one of the names. So people can take a course. As part of my participant observation, I have kind of completed 2 different doula trainings. So usually how in the States right now, DONA, which is Doula of North America, is a main professional organization. So you only need to complete a course that takes about 1 full weekend. And then you can go and say that you're a birth doula and start accompanying people, taking clients. There are also certification in which you have to pay in order to do that. And so right now, some of the criticisms is that it became a little bit kind of like yoga teacher training, where people can get a certain hour certified, but the range of training really differs, because someone, again, same as doula, you can train online, you can train with a major organization, or you can train with many other organizations. Some has a much more leftist political bent to their approach, while the other ones, including DONA, it's more like mainstream, don't rock the boat. Your only job is to providing a comforting presence kind of deal.
Right. And I'm very interested. You mentioned before, like the kind of a broadening of the reproductive justice framework. You write, and I'm quoting here: as Black feminist activist scholars point out, securing individuals' right not to have children is alone insufficient in addressing the compounding systems of oppression that marginalized communities face in their reproductive lives. And then you list 3 pillars, intersecting pillars of reproductive freedom. So they are like the right not to have a child, the right to have a child, and the right to parent children in safe and healthy environments. And I think it's fair to say that most people, myself included, up until like I think reading your paper, basically, we do know about the first 2. It's kind of it's. I wish I could say common sense, but it feels common sense anyway. People should do what they want to do with their body, essentially. But the third one is the one that is more, it has kind of a societal implication. I mean, the 3 of them do technically, but the third one has a more implicit one. So can you kind of walk us through this, and why do you think the third one is often not, let's say, prioritized?
Yeah. So again, the third one, it is to the ability to parent your children in a safe and sustainable environment, right? That can mean a lot of things. So, for instance, in the U.S., reproductive justice activists are also advocating for gun control. For example, if you have living in a community with a lot of gun violence, it is not safe with mass school shootings. So, on the other hand, you can also think about in terms of environmental racism. Certain areas are having kind of toxins dumped on their land and community. That again leads to, say, thinking about the Flint water crisis. The children are drinking water that again is harmful to their health. So you're absolutely right that the third pillar in particular really highlight the interconnectedness between reproduction and a whole host of societal issues, right? So I think that generally, if you even think about more not white feminist discourse about reproduction, tend to be about choice. That is kind of a more capitalistic, I'm a consumer, I'm supposed to be able to choose. But that framing, reproductive justice advocates argue that is quite limiting, because again, first of all, you're kind of confining the public imagination to thinking about, oh, reproduction is only about a women's issue and is only a consumerist issue about individual liberty. But when you're thinking about, okay, yes, you have a kid now, But then what if you just are in an environment where it's not safe to raise children? So the sense of safety then became, you cannot think about safety and cannot think about raising children in a healthy environment without also considering a lot of the institutional forces that are not just about consumer choices.
Yeah, and the justice aspect is key, I guess, because I can easily imagine and unfortunately, this is where my brain takes me, but I can easily imagine a conservative family saying, well, the right to what was it like to parent children in safe and healthy environments, actually reinforces the quote unquote traditional family,
Mhm.
the usual stuff that we often feel from the right. So in addition to this, it's important to emphasize, which obviously you're doing, the justice aspect of it, because it's
Mhm.
a society. There are lots of societal implications from something as simple as, well, okay, it's important to have the right to want to choose to have a child or not to
Mhm.
have a child. That's obviously very important, but where the child is actually going to grow up is as
Yes.
important, if not more important, basically. And yeah, it's very interesting. The way you're framing it, it makes a lot of sense to me, um, especially as it does definitely fit into choice, quote unquote,
Yes.
as a consumerist thing rather than as an ethical or as a right, essentially. Yeah.
Right. And I also kind of want to highlight the other point about the right to have children. And I think that at least in the US, when we consider reproductive politics, a lot of people are just thinking, oh, if you are on the left and you're thinking about reproduction, you're only just for abortion.
Yes.
And that's a highly reductive view, especially not true for reproductive justice, I call it RJ. Again, RJ have this one pillar on the right to have children, and that connects to a long history of eugenics, a
Hmm.
long history and ongoing actions in sterilizing incarcerated people, women of color, especially Black women. And you can even consider that globally, right? In Xinjiang, we hear about Uyghur women being have forced IUD implants.
Hmm.
A lot of these things, it's also about a biopolitical control of like certain people who are deemed inferior or racialized are not supposed to reproduce because of that sentiment that reproduction is only about proffering an ideal future citizenry. So in that sense, that the right for everybody to have children also kind of connects to disability justice as well, in the sense of people with disability or under conservatorship often were not allowed to have children. And some US states still have the laws that will allow parents of children with disability to forcibly sterilize them.
Oh, I actually didn't know about that. Wow. Okay. I mean, yeah. No, that also makes a lot of sense. I can, and also doesn't it also go back to the notion of like, the woman's body as being equal to the nation, and we also always
Mhm.
see these, obviously in right wing discourse to this day. It's
Mhm.
pretty much the same. I can think of, like, just to briefly mention a very obvious Lebanon example, which is in Lebanon, women still can't pass down the nationality. Um, and the reason, quote unquote, for that is actually because everything is sectarian in Lebanon. It goes back to the fact that I'm not gonna get too much into it, but it's about, like, let's say a Lebanese woman married to a Palestinian man or to a Syrian man. The politicians who are against this don't want those Syrian men to become
Mhm.
Lebanese, essentially, and so it becomes depriving the Lebanese woman from her right to pass on the citizenship because she made the quote unquote choice, or the mistake, let's say,
Yeah.
of marrying a non-Lebanese in this context. So yeah, we can really go through different
Yeah.
examples, but yeah. Um, 1 second. So okay, so there's this other thing. This is the maybe more academic one. So help me out as much as you can on this,
Correct.
because broader audience and stuff. And I want people to understand what I'm saying, because I always worry that I'm confusing myself and others in the process. But so you write that reproductive justice's intersectional orientation has the potential to enrich studies in the rhetorics of health and medicine, RHM. Okay, can you sort of explain that, if that's okay? And then I have a kind of a follow up.
Yeah, so rhetoric of health and medicine is a kind of subfield in rhetoric that looks into discourse surrounding usually the body. So that include looking into medical documents, patient menus, and some recent hot topics include some of my colleagues like to study why do people who are anti-vax, what arguments do they make? And when we combat them and try to give them facts, is it rhetorically actually effective and change their mind? So those are kind of some of the questions that RHM scholars look into. And one reason why I was making the argument that, say, reproductive justice as a framework has a lot to offer is that you can kind of think about discourse in health and medicine. We cannot separate that from thinking through in terms of people's positionalities, respective privileges, and marginalization.
Mm-hmm.
And so reproductive justice as a framework really allow us to think through that because it's founded by Black women, Indigenous women, and women of color. They are intersectional, again, I'm using Kimberly Crenshaw's here, occupying kind of multiple nexus of marginalization. So they know that, yes, as women, we're marginalized in one way, but our experience is not the same as a white woman's experience. So blackness or indigeneity, all of these things, and then plus social class, all of these things are kind of impacting how they are being acted on by dominant medical institutions and practices. So my argument here is that when we study these rhetorics of health and medicine, if we don't also think through how the community members and community stakeholders are differentially being impacted by it, we're missing kind of a big chunk of how biopolitics work.
Right. And so, okay, so there is this. The follow up was there's this sentence that you wrote, which is when analyzing the rhetorical effects of medical documents and practices on birth, rhetoricians who adopt an RJ, so reproductive justice informed model, will address the cis heteronormative assumptions in pregnancy and birth discourse and interrogate how non-normative users interact with these artifacts based on their specific lived experiences compared to mainstream audiences. And so, from what I understand, is it's not just treating people who are non-normative as special cases, quote unquote, but actually like their experiences as being as valuable as as legitimate, essentially as valid
Yes.
as anyone else's experiences. And through that, if we take that framework and use that as our base and a base assumption,
Mhm.
question what is considered normative, what
Yes.
is considered
Yeah.
quote unquote normal. Okay, does that make sense?
Mhm. Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. So I'll give an example. It's that
Yeah.
there is a report called Battling Over Birth in which the researchers conduct community interviews and focus group with a large number of Black women in California, asking them just kind of a wide range of questions about their pregnancy and birth experiences. And a lot of the women said that they hesitated and some choose even not to go to seek medical tests during their pregnancy. And so I think on first glance, if for someone with privilege, would be like, oh, these women, again, if you have a racist overtone to it, maybe like these Black women, they may not, they don't understand they're irresponsible to themselves and their fetus. But again, the intersectional framework is like, okay, what is going on in there? One is that a lot of these interviewees mentioned that they don't want to go to get health checks because they often treated poorly. They often encounter medical racism. There is also a rightful distrust of the medical institution, in part because of previous, medical testing on Black bodies without their consent. And so if you kind of think about it that way, the mainstream protocol of, oh, when you get pregnant, you go to your OBGYN and get tested and get health checks, that on the surface seems like a no-brainer. But if you kind of consider that from a more historical and intersectional perspective, you're starting to see why just telling people to go get your pregnancy checked out, that blanket statement is just not relevant to a lot of people's experience.
I mean, it's so this is very different. But even in my limited experience here, so I'm in Switzerland. there are lots of things that have like just these obstacles that exist because it's also a privatized healthcare system in Switzerland as well, like the American one actually. Um, well, I would argue probably slightly better, but there has lots of its problems as well. Um, those obstacles reduce the likelihood of me. So in theory, let's say I want to look up a therapist. I want to find a therapist.
Mhm.
In theory, it's straightforward. You call up some number, they redirect you somewhere else. It's kind of a process. But in practice, there are like waiting lists if you're citizen or non-citizen, or there are waiting lists if
Mhm.
you're any kind of different legitimate factors essentially that in what basically what how it translates into is that, well, in theory I have the same kind of access
Yes.
as other people. And again, I'm nowhere near kind of the worst case scenario here, but like in theory I have access to the same kind of stuff, but in practice I
Mhm.
don't. And it's that kind of thing where if we focus on those experiences, then we then re-question why are there these obstacles in the first place, why are and then it kind of can scale it up essentially, if that makes sense.
Yes, exactly. Again, I think that again, using this more intersectional framework and thinking about why non-normative people often don't feel comfortable utilizing dominant institutions, it kind of prompt us to question mainstream practices. We assume that they are just regular protocols. So in my interviews of birth workers, a lot of the times they said that their role is to question hospital protocol. For instance, they may have, this is a little bit less frequently performed, but they still happen. Epistemology, which is a procedure in which the OBGYN will cut part of the vaginal tissue during childbirth. And the idea is that so if you were to cut it, then it's less likely to tear. But again, research has shown that that's not true at all. Actually, the cutting causes more damage.
Hmm.
However, there's some more old school obstetrician that will still do that sometimes without telling the patient. They just take a pair of scissors and cut. And so some of the interviewees that I have say that they, of course, they saw what is happening. And often what they would do is they kind of ask, hey, Dr. So-and-so, looks like you picked up scissors. What are you trying to do? So kind of prompting the providers to question the protocol, rather than otherwise they may just think that, oh, this is just part of my menu. This is just part of everyday practice.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and another example may be to think about queer people or trans people who are pregnant. Again, technically they can seek medical treatment the way that everybody can, but um, discourse and medical practices surrounding pregnancy and birth is highly gendered, so they may not feel comfortable being in a place where they were constantly being called women when they do not identify as such.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing to have access in theory, but it's another thing to I don't know, if you have like 10 options to constantly worry like which one of those 10 is most likely to do you damage or most likely to respect you. It's like a different kind of calculation that you will have to make essentially. Is this related to there's this term that you use, like the technocratic model of birth?
Yeah.
um because you give the example of Khadija. Actually, I don't remember, was she in the Doula Diaries?
Yeah.
Okay, so she's a working class black woman, and so this is what you write about her example, her story. In a mainstream hospital setting, providers are trained to preserve the status quo and power hierarchy between them and their patients, partly through administering what they consider to be routine procedures without always fully giving patients the opportunities to question and refuse them, what we just mentioned.
Mhm.
And disrespect for the birthing person's bodily autonomy and informed choice is compounded when the person is disadvantaged by other marginalized positions they occupy. End quote. So this goes back to the whole question of autonomy and choosing. It's one thing to have that. I guess I'm really just repeating myself. It's one thing to have that in theory. It's another thing to actually not know or even know in advance that the doctor that you may be seeing is likely to
Yes.
already have conclusions in advance because you're black or because you're trans or because X, Y, and Z, whatever. And we see this, I mean, even in um, like cis straight women cases. I know this from family members who misdiagnose very late because their, period pains were not taken too seriously because, oh, that's
Mhm.
just a normal monthly thing, or, etc., etc. But so with that in mind, or maybe using Khadija's story, how would you explain, what do you call it again, the technocratic model of birth, and how, yeah, like what's the problem with it? Let's put it that way.
Yeah, so that concept, it's termed by a medical anthropologist, Robbie Davis Floyd. So she distinguished a technocratic model from what she called a more humanist model, and then in between you have a blended one. So technocratic one, it's training doctors as if they are always following a specific set of protocol, and so you value efficiency and you value certainty. So then, for instance, you often hear doctors saying that, oh, you have to be induced at a certain week, otherwise your baby will be too big and it will be dangerous. And again, research actually shows that that's not always true. And in fact, a lot of the cases, even if you're not induced, it's okay. Or that some hospitals and some obstetricians have a much higher rate of going through a C-section, in part because C-section is a surgery that can be scheduled, so you know when it's going to be done. Versus if you have somebody do a vaginal birth, especially the unmedicated one, you have no idea how long you may be held up. And so, a technocratic model, again, you can think about it as valuing more of a commercial model, thinking of the body as if it is a machine. So if you're not doing, your body is not doing the way that the textbooks, the protocols are supposed to be doing, that might be something wrong with your body. So we're gonna do interventions to fix it. And
Yeah.
so they're not necessarily seeing the patient or the birthing person as a person that is not just having a mechanical body. And so a humanistic view, on the other hand, it's again a more holistic lens of seeing that. And so thinking about, yeah, somebody may not opt for an epidural, which is it's an injection put up through the spine that will numb you from the waist down. Some people may not want that, or offering a variety of pain management, and also not using medical interventions as quickly just because a birth is not progressing according to the textbook.
This completely ties into like the what we started talking about, the societal implications, because I mean, for one, those we often hear a lot of stories of how why are certain procedures financed better than others, and there's almost always like a gender and or a racist and or a class,
Mhm.
component to it. um, Very straightforward things like, under research in endometriosis, which is something that
Mhm.
recently, because of a family member, is recently something that I'm trying to learn about. um, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And also the notion of the, if I understand correctly, like the sorry, what was it called again, the technocratic model, not just of birth but like in general. It's also like, you only have a certain allocated amount of time because
Yes.
it costs money. And then it goes back to what is insured if you live in that kind of
Mhm.
healthcare system. And other some
Mhm.
stuff, you will actually have to wait a bit longer, because I can, very basic examples like, my insurance this year runs at the finishes at the end of this year, and then there's a new one starting January. So
Uh-huh.
if I met my primes, I want to, I can see the doctor now in December and it will be covered, and if I see the doctor in January, it's not covered anymore.
Mhm.
It's very basic stuff like this, and obviously you can scale it up, and you can, using the intersectional
Mhm.
framework, include all of those other factors. And I guess, sometimes, maybe naively so, but a bit baffled that this isn't more obvious. But okay, so that being said, um so this is gonna be a weird pivot, but bear with me. We Last time I had you on, we spoke about, well, very different topic at surface level anyway, like Hong Kong, and I think we mentioned like disinformation and the heaviness of disinformation and even
Mhm.
trauma, all of that. I'm kind of curious in a kind of a purposefully abstract way. of, because you talk a lot, you mention stories that are untellable, right? Like there are stories
Mhm,
that you tell the stories of those people that are deemed to be untellable. And so very broadly, my question is going to be broad just to kind of give you the space to
yeah.
talk, say whatever you want. But like what makes some stories in your view untellable, um compared to others, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so I remember writing in that line in my article I wrote about certain birth stories are not tellable, which kind of it's what make the Doula Diary, despite some of its flaws, a powerful documentary. So certain stories are untellable in the sense that it does not fit into the mainstream imaginary of what that thing should be. So, for instance, you may tell a birth story that have struggles, but you ended up having this healthy, beautiful child, and you then live happily ever after. But the untellable stories from some of my interviewee was like, sometimes what if the ambivalence with a pregnancy or the struggles with postpartum, feeling like the depression,
Right.
feeling like maybe made a mistake, I don't want this child, or trauma that was induced during the birthing process. So those became untellable, or if they were told, the person often experienced a lot of shame, in part because their stories do not fit into the narrative of what we want to hear. And that again also ties into other aspects of the rhetoric of health and medicine. For example, a colleague of mine wrote about what kind of narratives we want to hear from cancer patients. We often
Mm.
want to hear that they are resilient and they continue to do
Survivors,
things
all
and are
right.
inspired. Yeah, and are inspiring. Anything else were rendered kind of just either liminal at best or kind of abject at most, to be like, why is this such a perverted narrative? So birth especially is another one, and I would say that is there also a trend of called kind of the self-made mom, which is, if you it's a whole genre of YouTube videos and Instagram posts of women having home birth without any medication, without, because it's called free birth.
Right.
So the narrative there is that, by going through this free birth, you tapped into this biologically essentialist like women power. And so if you have not gone that route, if you have used an epidural or have a C-section, then you're somehow not as womanly, or you're not as strong and not as good a mother. So that kind of
Mm.
assumption also makes medicated birth, for some people, like they don't want to talk about it because it doesn't fit into that imaginary of like this powerful woman having a natural birth experience.
Which goes back again to, you mentioned the self-made thing. It's, I mean, it's incredible how many things go back to that of, yeah, like individual choices, individual thing is just you, and if you don't do it right, that's basically your fault. And
Mm-hmm.
just to, because you mentioned it before, and I feel like I can't help but ask that question about the anti-vax stuff, because I mean, Switzerland has, I think, comparable rates of vaccination to the US, which is relatively low to other places.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's not exactly the same kind of dynamics, but there are certain dynamics that are similar that I can definitely see here as well. Especially the sort of intersection with far right stuff, which we're seeing
Mm-hmm.
more and more about, more and more of. I mean, in Switzerland, but in France as well. I think in the UK
Yeah.
as well, and Germany for sure. You mentioned that there is kind of a whole, I don't know, maybe like a field of study, or at least lots of people are asking the question of like, well, how do we talk to someone who would identify as an anti-vaxxer, for example? And there is that question, and I know that just throwing facts often doesn't work. I know this from just like other aspects, that other,
Mm-hmm.
let's say, situations that in many ways are even darker than the anti-vax stuff, although it's getting darker in that sense as well. Um, what are, from what you know anyway, what are certain, I'm not going to say tips because that doesn't make much sense, but what are certain practices that, if someone listening does know someone who is anti-vax, or, um, let me move this way. You because you study the link between reproductive justice and rhetorical analysis. What are certain things that rhetorical analysis can offer, let's put it that way, even maybe RJ framework can offer us in tackling that issue? Let's put it that way.
Yeah. So, for instance, my colleagues who study that, again, I can kind of email you the link later, had found that they were looking into internet forums of people who are like arguing with each other. Often the issue is that they are fundamentally occupying different kinds of truth realities. So you can see that happening not just with vaccine, but also, for example, the US, the election, whether the election is fraudulent, is that some folks do not see certain evidence, or in this case, scientific evidence, as credible. And so when one group is seeing anecdotal evidence that, oh, my friend's kid got autism, and so I don't, after getting vaccinated. So that's also highly ableist. But they're seeing that as an evidence base. So they already have distrust of authority. And then here you are quoting the CDC to them. It's going to make them double down, because essentially in rhetorical theory is something called a stasis theory, which is in ancient Roman court. When in a court case, when you're arguing something, they often will ask you to go through 4 questions. One is like, is there a problem? Second layer, what is the definition of the problem? What is the degree? So if you don't do anything about it, what will happen? And the last one is like the policy, and like what should we do about it? And so in that particular tradition, they will actually ask the two sides to stop until they can reach stasis on one level, each level. And so here, the vaccine, you can think that we're already arguing about at the policy level what we should and should not do. But when they're already not agreeing whether there is a problem, the definition of the problem. So it ended up is kind of the conversation ended up being just constantly talking past across each other when there's not even an established reality, shared reality and vocabularies of doing so. And so, yeah, so I think there's some strategies that researchers have identified include kind of like using stories to counter their stories rather than solely holding on to what we think are the evidence and facts, even though they really are the evidence and facts.
Yeah, the autism thing always makes me laugh because I'm autistic, and when I got my second shot, I just joked that I got like an upgrade in my autism, and it's just one of those things where like I admit I do have difficulties. Luckily, no one I know in family and friends, which is incredible given the statistics that we know, is like there was like some vaccine hesitancy at first, especially when
Mhm.
the information that was coming in was a bit confusing for a lot of people, and so like I can understand that, and most of the time you can just have a chat, and it's not like a hotline
Mhm.
position or anything. Um, but yeah, I do admit that I still have difficulties to this day. It's been 2 years. It's gonna be 2 years soon of a pandemic at the end of the day, and it feels a lot like the conversation, and I feel like I'm giving it too much value by calling it a conversation, because as you said, it's often just talking past one another,
Mhm.
and it's at this point it's like almost entirely online, yelling at each other online or yelling to each other online about other
Mhm.
people, and occasionally this manifesting itself in often bad ways on the streets. I mean, we're chatting on the November 22nd. There was like riots in Rotterdam 2 days ago, and in the US it's
Mhm.
ongoing. And I mean, lots. I'm sure there are lots of examples, and even by the time this comes out in January, there's going to be even more examples,
Yeah.
unfortunately. So yeah, it's something that I'm trying to my best to not judge necessarily. I do know where the disinformation especially comes from, but also where the misinformation networks come from. That's my way of coping, or like intellectualizing it is my way
Yeah.
of coping with it, because otherwise I'm just gonna insult that anti-vaxxers online, which is not gonna do any difference. So yeah, that's just me. But listeners can reach their own conclusions. If there are people who are way more pissed off than I am, and I have conversations about it with them, and yeah, yeah. Anyway, this is kind of a conversation in of itself, I think. But it does bring me to the a question I had, or I still have, of like I everything you mentioned, in many ways, okay, this can be like, okay, this is just an academic thing. We can just talk about it within academic circles. But everything that you also mentioned, I can definitely see how do you say, like, applications in the activist world or applications in even policy world, and it's just it's things that would I'm trying my best in this podcast, if that's not clear by now, that to argue, if you want, that the stuff that we can learn in academia, not all of them but a lot of them, have real life consequences, and the fact that they're not out there the way they should be is a problem in and of itself. So
Mhm.
can walk us through a bit more, if that's okay. You already did a bit, but the first question I think I asked, like, how did you go from thinking about rhetoric to thinking about reproductive justice? If that's okay, to just ask you to expand a bit more on that, because I'm very curious, and I think listeners who are struggling with other stuff like the anti-vaxxer stuff that we mentioned, which is probably the most topical thing at this moment, to kind of make sense of how information is this is it. This is, sorry, I'm confusing myself as well. Like how information can be weaponized. Okay, we know this,
Mhm.
but why is information in of itself not enough? If that,
Mhm.
just
Yeah.
tell me
Yeah.
if this was confusing.
No, it makes no sense. So I
Okay.
again using the anti-vax example
Yeah.
again. We often have this cognitive bias called like the false dichotomy, which is like, oh, we are the smart one, and those people who like don't think like us, they're all the same. So we have kind of this also out group homogeneity, right?
Yeah.
Thinking that our in group we have nuance, but those people they're all kind of dumb and they think in a weird way. But so with the anti-vaccine or vaccine hesitancy, they're actually in the US a lot of vaccine hesitant people are people of color,
Yeah.
Black
Yeah.
people, Latina people. If we were to say that, oh, they're just Trumpers, they're just like far right people, we're actually erasing a lot of the historical causes within among that the phenomenon. So I think that in that case, using an intersectional approach would kind of prompt us to think about, okay, what so for Black people who historically were marginalized by government health system,
Mm-hmm.
they are rightfully suspicious that, hey, it's free, like you never offer us free stuff. It's only when you're trying to do medical testing on Black bodies, so why
Yeah, but
should we
I
trust
never
you?
thought about that. Right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so there's a lot of distrust about we always have to pay for things. It never is free. And now you're giving this thing for free, must be something fishy is going on.
Right.
So similarly, kind of with the Hispanic, Latino communities, it's also a historic, without any much of any relationship with the public health system, and only is within the pandemic, then the doors are being knocked on and say, hey, you need to get vaccinated. And so, without any prior relationship, and also the relationship with the government tends to be one of surveillance for
Mm-hmm.
most people of color
Mm-hmm.
communities. So they're also kind of questioning, like, really, is this sounds too good to be true? Something must not be right. So that means I kind of use this as an example to highlight why a one size argument doesn't really fit all. So you may tell them, hey, no, I'll give you all the science. This is great. But none of those arguments is going to help erase or ameliorate that sense of suspicion that they felt that is long held for generations. So I think that's one reason too, why argumentation, you can have the most foolproof logical argument and it still won't work if you're not kind of contextualizing what situation you're speaking in right now.
Yeah, I can. I will remember the specifics and I will link it in the show notes. But I can think of the many examples and stories that I've read of. For example, I think it's definitely somewhere in modern North America, but it's an indigenous group that was disproportionately affected by COVID, and the way they tackled it, because there was a lot of vaccine
Mhm.
hesitancy, in addition to the structural problems of like lack of access to healthcare and stuff like that. The way they tackled it is actually, it was a community-based solution. They had a bunch of people just literally from the community go, door to door essentially, and vaccinate a bunch of people. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, there was a very similar example as well in Brazil with an indigenous community there. And I'm sure there's many more examples of that. So I'll find some of them and include them in the show notes and description. And I guess the lesson there is pretty obvious, that if part of the problem, and I'm putting aside the far right stuff and the stuff that kind of like, which I think a lot of people are what they think about, and it is a problem and probably going to become more and more of a problem. But it's also the case that if our goal is, for example, to vaccinate as many people as possible, if our goal is to stop misinformation and disinformation, etc., it doesn't, like, even from a purely pragmatic policy whatever level, it doesn't make much, even activist level, it doesn't make much sense to say they're all the same, fuck them, and whatever. And I say this with a lot of caveats because, again, I don't think I'm particularly good at this. I do think I'm someone who, I'm very impatient, I'm very tired, I admit it. But because I admit it, I also don't participate online in that kind of discourses because I feel like I'm not gonna be very good at it. So but or when I do, I have shared that story of the indigenous community, for example, because that feels like, well, maybe this is one way of actually dealing with it. And I also thought, I forgot the name, I will remember it again, and sorry, I'm bad at this, but I put it on the show. There's a podcast that is entirely, it's hosted by two African Americans, I believe, and it's entirely about conspiracies in the African American community. And so it's like comedy as well, so like they joke about it, and it's like, a lot of things about the man and stuff like that. But I'm fairly convinced, if I remember correctly, there is also an episode on the anti-vax issue. And I'm sure, I remember they tackled it in a very nuanced way, in a very way that like feels like it. They would persuade people instead of convincing people, if that makes sense. And this, I mean, it feels that this is the way to go, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and also in the States, there are public health officials and also doctors are starting to pivot their approach with the Latinx community.
Okay.
So instead of just having, here are some leaflets, they're doing Zoom town halls in Spanish and allowing people to ask questions. Having also Latinx medical providers answer some of the questions.
Sure. Yeah.
So those they this particular approach, the public health officials, like, yeah, it's not going to be fast. I think another thing is that, again, we're thinking, connecting back to the technocratic model, we want efficiency. We want it to be like, we just roll out something and then it will work in a large scale. But you can think about it having community-based outreach, community-based approaches. They're kind of by definition small and not necessarily like at a national level. So often the tension is like, we can gradually scale up and hopefully that one community will kind of spread the information out, but it's not really the dominant preference, which is like to do it fast and scale up immediately.
Yeah. Which I mean, I completely agree that this is, it feels like this is the way to go. Which poses kind of the question of like how to do this when time is of the essence and when there is this component, and I mean, it's that's probably for smarter people than me on this. But anyway, the so just go back to RJ and to reproductive justice in general before getting to the book section. Gonna finish the episode. Um, what are certain other venue, like in your research, you went through all of the stories, the Doula Diaries and other examples, and you went through statistics and a bunch of data and stuff like that. What are certain what are certain questions that came out of that research that you maybe one day would get into? What are sort of like open questions, if that makes sense, that, because I can imagine the more you dig deep, the more questions are gonna arise from, well, intersection framework by definition tries to be as inclusive as possible. So what are certain like future venues, if you want, of exploration for you when it comes to the link between reproductive justice, between and rhetoric or rhetoric analysis?
Yeah, so right now I'm actually collaborating with Dr. Natalie Fixmer-Oritz at the University of Iowa on a book project on RJ. So that particular book project, we are kind of looking into the gender and sexuality and the language aspect. What we're finding, again, we talked about how practices and mainstream discourse on birth and pregnancy is so gendered to the extent of often assuming a sense of biological essentialism, like, oh, the women body can give birth, and we'll have something called like the orgasmic birth from the midwife in a May Gaskin. But on the other hand, non-binary people, trans people give birth and get pregnant too. And so our question is that there are reproductive rights organizations that insist on using the word women rather than people. So, including reproductive justice, some activists, Black women activists, Indigenous women, their argument is that if we were to move away from this women-centered language, then we are erasing part of their experience and oppression that is based on their gender identity. But on the other hand, we have intersectional feminists and trans and queer non-binary people like, we're not erasing anything. We are just merely wanting to include other gendered identities. And so we are right now writing a book manuscript looking into how different stakeholders navigate this. So that will include queer and non-binary parents, birth workers, including a lot of queer birth workers and how they navigate that. And then also reproductive right organizations. Some of them have to have women in their name or in their project for funding purposes, because there are certain fundings that are only for women's health. And so if they said pregnant people's health, they may not be able to get certain funding. And so there are a lot of kind of variety of reasons, even among people who generally agree on the big picture, but kind of really disagree on how to talk about the gender and women aspect of it.
Right. So, do you know the title of the book, or when is it going to come out?
We are working on it right now. So we have an article in process. The book title would be New Grandmas for Reproductive Justice. And fingers crossed, University of California Press is interested. So hopefully we'll kind of be able to publish with them in a few
Cool.
years.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I definitely look forward to that. Well, speaking of book, as always on this podcast, can you recommend 3 books to our listeners?
Yeah, so it'll be related to my research interest right now. I think the first one is Dána-Ain Davis's book called Reproductive Injustice, Racism, Pregnancy, and Premature Birth. It's by the NYU Press. Davis herself is a medical anthropologist and also a trained doula. So this is an ethnographic work on medical racism, how medical racism influenced Black women who have given birth, especially premature birth and also low birth weight infants. And so it is a book that draw on Ain Davis's own participant observations and interviews. And so it has won several different awards in 2020 in anthropology and ethnographic writing. And see, the second one I would recommend, along a similar line, but it's not an academic book. It's written by the journalist Dani McClain called We Live for the We, The Political Power of Black Motherhood. So McClain herself was at the time raising a daughter on her own as a Black woman, and she encountered a lot of hostile and unjust situations during birth and pregnancy. And so this book is her journalistic, so in part, kind of part memoir, personal narrative, and part journalistic investigation and interviews with Black mothers who have kind of mobilized Black motherhood at a basis of their social movement for social change. And then the third one, also an NYU Press book, is called Trans Medicine. The Emergence and Practice of Treating Gender, and it's written by Steph M. Schuster. So I kind of talk just a little bit about how queer and trans people often face a lot of marginalization in mainstream birth and pregnancy, reproduction in general. That to date, medicine as a field does not have a lot of robust research on trans people, in part because it's not really valued or they don't think that it's important. And so trans medicine is a fascinated ethnographic and archival research-based book. So Schuster were attending medical conferences, interviewing medical professionals who practice transgender medicine and looking into archive as well into historical changes and current approaches to gender affirming care, and focusing in part on how existing stigma against trans people influence the research or the lack thereof, and also treatment plans. Essentially, it's showing that even physicians who are practicing trans medicine, a lot of them don't really know because they're lacking in research. So it really rely on the physicians' like individual gut feelings and their personal approaches, which again, of course, shows a big limitation in gender affirming care.
That's really interesting. I'm gonna get all of them. Sharon, thanks a lot for your time again. This has been really informative, and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you so much.